My name is Dr. David Nalin, and in 1971, I was a senior resident at the Harvard Medical School at the Boston City Hospital at that time. The way I got involved with this part of the world was I had applied to the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland of the United States, and was selected. And actually, originally I had planned to go to Panama, but the research laboratory there had a director who was not fond of MDs. He was a PhD. And just as I was about to go, my boss had just got off the plane from East Pakistan and said, instead of Panama, why don't you go to Pakistan? And I thought, well, what am I going to do about my Spanish? I've just been brushing it up. But I did take his advice. He said that the laboratory in Dhaka, at the then Cholera Research Hospital, was doing very interesting work on cholera and new treatments, and he thought I should go there. So I, somewhat reluctantly, I must admit, got on a plane for East Pakistan and landed in Dhaka in August of '67. And it turned out to be a very fortunate decision because the laboratory was on the verge of remarkable breakthroughs, and I was able to lead the team to develop oral rehydration therapy, and in a clinical trial, first demonstrate that it was effective, and then with my colleague Dr. Richard Cash, went on to do the first field trial, and eventually, of course, it became used globally with the help of WHO and UNICEF. The British Medical Journal has, a few years ago, credited it with saving more than 50 million lives to date. So it was a very good decision. After the war, when millions of refugees fled to the Salt Lake camps near Calcutta, one of our Indian colleagues, Dr. Mahalanobis, who had been at the Johns Hopkins Center in Calcutta, he heard of our work and adapted it in the refugee camps. And although under those disastrous conditions they couldn't do scientific measurements, nevertheless, with a limited amount of IV treating thousands of patients, they were able to reduce the death rate to a very low level. So that was a very dramatic demonstration, again, a confirmation of its efficacy. When I was back in Boston, then all of a sudden we thought a miracle was happening. We heard that Pakistan was having elections, and we thought that General Yahya had suddenly changed his mind. This must be an act of God. And so we were very happy, and everybody thought real democracy is coming. But of course, March 25th, the tragedy began to unveil itself, and we were horrified to hear about the slaughter, and immediately were shocked because the Nixon administration was denying that the slaughter was going on, whereas our friends and colleagues still at the Cholera Research Laboratory, now the ICDDRB, were sending photographs back of the murdered victims. And we took those to Senator Fulbright, who began hearings in the Congress. And then we saw that the Nixon administration was denying it still and sending arms to Pakistan. So I, along with several colleagues, all of us had been in Dhaka before the war, including Dr. Greeno and Anna Taylor. We founded, the three of us co-founded the Bangladesh Information Center, which was the leading lobbying coordination organization in Washington, D.C. And fortunately, I had left Harvard and was at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, only 45 minutes from Washington, D.C. And since we were so near, it facilitated our going to Washington and eventually renting a townhouse and hiring people and coordinating all of the lobbying. And in fact, I'm currently in the process of trying to catalog the very extensive files of the Bangladesh Information Center, which I have, and which include numerous invaluable letters, including from Ted Kennedy, who helped us, Senators Saxby and Church, and others who eventually sponsored the Saxby Church Amendment to cut off arms to Pakistan that were being used to slaughter Bengalis. So this grew into a very considerable effort and involved the help of many individuals from all over the United States who came and checked with us about who needed lobbying and where to go to meet the senators or congressmen or congresswomen. And eventually, the Saxby Church Amendment was passed, and there was a ban on arms to Pakistan. Of course, Nixon tried to secretly avoid it. And in those days, one has to realize it was before Watergate, so the American public thought the president could never lie. We learned differently later. But nevertheless, the effort was highly successful. It did eventually cut off aid. And then the war, with the advent of the Indian invasion and the efforts of the Muktabahini, it eventually ended earlier than we thought it would. And as I say, in early January, I arrived back in Dhaka. With Anna Taylor and Maggie Eisenstein, we initiated the hunger strike in front of the White House in Lafayette Park. And this was actually our second demonstration. The first one didn't attract much attention. It was near the Pakistan embassy because due to a complaint that was lodged, the police asked us to move very quickly because we didn't have a permit. So better informed by that event, we got a permit for the Lafayette Park demonstration and also assisted other groups, notably the Quaker groups. And the Quakers, of course, are an early part of their history goes back to colonial America and William Penn and others. And many of them were arrested. They have a belief that, according to the Constitution, since Americans are supposed to be able to assemble for political peaceful demonstrations, one shouldn't need a permit. And so they went right out there, and I must say I admire their courage, including in the episode where they went out in boats to try to stop one of the ships sailing out of Baltimore Harbor and encountered police resistance. But that created quite a bit of publicity. And of course, nationally and very importantly, internationally, the news was coming out, the Mascarenhas articles from London, wide publicity in the media from Time and Newsweek about the Salt Lake camps and the atrocities. And so there was a significant body of public opinion that was mounting to prevent further aid in the efforts of the Pakistan Army in Bangladesh. When we needed additional staff, David Weisbrod, who was here last year, took over with Kaiser Zaman, who was a Bangladeshi, and they were the director and assistant director of the Bangladesh Information Center in Washington. I had, in the interim, been appointed, I was to be appointed director of the Johns Hopkins Center in Calcutta, but because of the Nixon tilt towards Pakistan, Indira Gandhi banned all American scientists from coming at the time. So I was waiting to go, and then in discussions with Johns Hopkins officers, I suggested that we transfer the Johns Hopkins Center back to Dhaka. And so that's what I was sent back to do, and I did extensive negotiations with the newly installed Bangladesh government and the health ministry, including working out details of the agreements with Johns Hopkins, which ultimately were signed. And then the Johns Hopkins unit was established at Dhaka and eventually was internationalized and became the ICDDRB. Then Ted Kennedy came to visit, and I escorted him. He did visit the Cholera Hospital. I escorted him around and explained the situation. We initially had a group of Muktabahini stationed at the Cholera Hospital, and I showed them my letter from M.R. Siddiqui, so they were assured that I was there to help get the hospital refunded. I did that through the International Rescue Committee. USAID wanted to send funds to give some salary to the workers, almost 600 workers at the hospital who had been cut off from funding. The funding, of course, used to go through Islamabad, and they were not sending any money to independent Bangladesh. So I was appointed a temporary consultant to the International Rescue Committee, and I have a photograph somewhere of myself giving the first large check to the deputy director who had become the director by then and returned from the States, Dr. Kendrick Hare. So that was a way of, in that interim, continuing to pay the salaries of our employees. In fact, I was at the airport when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was flown back from Pakistan. And I still remember how remarkable it was that everyone was waiting. There was a huge crowd. And all of a sudden, there was at first like a hush and then a growing noise. And I looked up, and they must have had sharper eyes than I could, but they had spotted this tiny dot of the plane up in the sky. And everyone started to get very excited. And then I could see it, and it landed. And when it got off, of course, everybody was just in rapture. It was terrific. Later on, M.R. Siddiqui personally introduced me to Sheikh Mujib. The amazing thing is when one looks back at those difficult times, how wonderful the progress of the country has been since then. I mean, when I think of what Dhaka looked like in those days, and when I came back yesterday and saw what Dhaka is today, I mean, at that time I lived in the outskirts of Dhaka in Gulshan, and now Gulshan is downtown, sort of. So it's quite amazing. It's a wonderful feeling, and I'm very grateful to the Bangladesh government and people. The fact that after so many years they are remembering the efforts of those of us who helped. We were not looking for recognition, of course. It would have been impossible to live with oneself and not rise up against what was going on and try to alter the course of events.